Elena set the
you need to
grocery
wake
bag
up.
down
What's
and
in
the
your
paper
hand?
crinkled under her
The
palm.
envelope, don't let
She saw the single
It's
sealed
alright, just
envelope
hold
on the
on.
kitchen table before she felt anything else. Suspicion tightened Elena's fingers as she lifted the envelope and read the single line written on the flap. All conversation must be written from now on. She stood in the doorway with her coat still on, a wet stripe at the hem, and the rule made one thing clear: someone had decided speech would be dangerous. Marco's key scraped the lock while Elena read the line again, and the sound cut across the kitchen like a warning. Elena's first reaction was practical. She set the grocery bag down with care, checked that the sink was empty, and slid her hand into her coat pocket for the small fountain pen she always carried. She did not reach for a phone. Her eyes kept returning to the envelope as if the paper might move. She had left this house 3 years earlier because words in this room had become weapons. Now a rule written on paper claimed to protect them from the same weapons. The central problem sat plainly on the table. Speech was forbidden, and the family had agreed to that silence. The kitchen light above the table hummed. Elena looked at the chair where she had once sat with her mother and father and counted the days since she had spoken to Luca without a wall between them. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the motion steady, and opened the grocery bag instead of opening the envelope. She needed to make a small order of tasks feel normal, set out the cans, tuck a loaf into a cloth, because normal actions kept panic at bay. Her hands moved with intentional slowness. Marco shoved the back door open with both hands and came in with his hair still damp from street rain. "Elena," he said before he could stop himself, and his voice hit the rule like a thrown stone. He slammed a fist on the table. He carried a stack of letters tied with a rubber band and dropped them down so hard the dishes rattled. Marco's breathing was fast. He glared at the envelope on the table, and then at Elena. "Marco, don't," Elena, and then she stopped. She had already broken the rule by answering him. Marco stepped forward and shoved the stack toward her. "These are all unsent," he said, nodding at the loop of letters. "She wrote to us, and we did nothing." His voice had the raw angle of someone who had been holding words too long. Marco's impatience created friction. He paced 2 quick steps, then halted at the window and leaned close to the glass. Elena watched him move. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. He flattened his palm on the sill and squinted out into the street. "There's a car, Marco," and his tone changed from anger to sharp concern in the single syllable. He pointed across the street. "Dark, idling. They've been there since I left work. I didn't want to bring it up until you got here." His voice snapped between accusation and warning. Elena walked to the window and lifted the curtain corner with the tip of a finger. She could see the glossy black of a sedan reflected in the wet pavement. Headlights off, a low silhouette behind the glass, her throat tightened. The house felt smaller. Luca stood under the doorway like a carved figure. He had not spoken on his way in. He never needed to explain his arrival. He folded his gloves into his hands and watched Marco and Elena the way a man watches the chessboard before moving a piece. Luca placed a folded envelope in front of Elena without a word and stepped back into the doorway. He kept his hands still. He wore a tailored dark suit despite the rain, and his coat was dry where it hung over his arm. Elena's breathing changed, but she did not reach for the envelope. Instead, she sat down. She chose the chair opposite Luca and smoothed the tablecloth with a fingertip as if practicing steadiness. She unwrapped her fountain pen and set the cap aside. Her eyes avoided looking directly at Luca. She measured him in small movements. The way he tapped the corner of a letter with his thumb, the shallow line at his jaw where a thin scar cut through skin. She wrote because the rule asked for it, and because speaking had become a trigger she did not trust. Her handwriting kept a steady slant. She wrote, "Why, silence. What danger are you protecting us from?" She folded the paper and slid it across the table. Luca watched the letter move and kept his gaze cool. He did not pick it up right away. Marco could not contain himself. "Luca, answer her," he said, and his voice rose with the quick rhythm that made Elena flinch. "Elena has every right to know. Tell her." Now he reached for Luca's sleeve as if he could force words out of him by shaking him. Luca did not turn. He kept his hands folded. His jaw moved slightly. The atmosphere in the room narrowed. Marco's hand brushed Luca's coat and Luca's arm moved, a small reflex. He put his free hand into his inner pocket and took out a folded photograph and a short note marked with a red corner. Marco lunged forward without thinking and yanked them out of Luca's palm. The photograph slid like a blade across the table and came to rest near Elena's plate. Elena bent down and picked up the photograph. Her eyes followed the image. It showed a man in a black jacket standing in front of a storefront she recognized from the neighborhood. The man in the photo had his face turned away, but the jacket stitching was unique and she knew that pattern because she had once mended a tear in a similar coat. The note folded behind the photograph bore one sentence underlined twice that read, "Watch the Rossi house. Movement will be punished." The handwriting was angular. The note smelled faintly of printer ink and cigarette smoke. A new urgency arrived with the photograph. Elena set it down and felt the weight of truth move across the table. Marco stared at the image with both anger and the quick fear of someone who had misjudged how close danger had come. Luca closed his eyes for a second and then opened them. He touched the corner of the photograph with the pad of his thumb, as if testing the paper's finish. The first emotional shift happened then. Suspicion became alarm. Elena's pulse stepped up. She stopped focusing on rules and started cataloging reality. Her hands trembled when she reached for the envelope Luca had placed earlier. She unfolded Luca's terse note. He had written, not more words. "Trust the paper." Elena read it twice. Marco pushed for an answer. "Luca, what does that mean?" Marco demanded, "Who wrote this? Who's watching us?" Luca wrote slowly, each letter measured. He slid the fresh paper toward Marco and kept his own eyes on Elena. He did not speak, the note read. "The man in the photo is part of a surveillance cell. We cannot risk conversation. Not because I want distance, but because they can use what we say." The words were shorter than Elena needed. They carried decision instead of explanation. Elena looked at Luca and the way his hands rested on the table. She watched the gold signet ring on his finger reflect the kitchen light. She thought of the nights she had left, of slamming doors and raised voices, and she felt a bitter memory of the last time a conversation had cost them something. She held the pen and felt its weight like a tool for slow repair. She wrote, "If your silence is protection, tell me how it protects. Show me something I can hold." She folded the paper and pushed it to him. Marco was cruel with words when he felt helpless. "Show us, show us." He said, "Luca, that's ridiculous. We deserve to speak face to face." Elena should not have to write like a prisoner, his breath left in quick bursts. "You can't just lock us in rules and hope that keeps everyone safe. You can't decide everything by yourself." The exchange shortened into a sequence of fast lines. Luca tapped the corner of the new note with his thumb. He did not reply aloud. He wrote, "There are 2 offers to our family that I refused. One was money, one was a name. We refused both. The man in the photo is a scout for the other side. He watches patterns. Who talks? Where? About what? If he reports normal conversation, they escalate." Luca slid the paper toward Marco. His handwriting made each consonant blunt. This was the second emotional shift, from alarm to cautious trust. Elena felt the shift like a pivot. She recognized the calculation in Luca's face. Not cruelty, but containment. She saw that his control had a target. It was not total punishment, but a narrow, grim tactic. Elena's shoulders loosened a fraction. She put down her pen and looked at the stack of unsent letters Marco had brought in. They were dated over months, names, apologies, arguments. They had been folded and held back. Elena understood in a new way that the family had been living inside a policy meant to starve information in order to starve threat. Marco would not accept a half answer. He reached across the table and dropped one of his unsent letters face up. "This is from you, Luca, Marco," and his voice made Elena look. Luca's hands remained still. The letter Marco showed had Luca's neat hand on the top and a single line, "I will keep you safe." Marco snatched the letter back and read aloud, "He will keep you safe. Is that why you kept us away? Because you thought we were fragile? Is that why you left me in the dark?" His words clipped into the room like nails. Words moved faster now. Marco leaned in and the argument became a sequence of short, rapid exchanges. "Luca, you hid everything. Marco, you don't get to decide how we love or hate you. You don't get to write the terms and expect us to sign them in silence." Luca set his jaw and then used his handwriting to answer. "I did not hide everything. I chose a painful protection." Marco's right hand knocked at the table 3 times, rapid and sharp. Elena watched the boy she had known as a child turn into a man who would demand truth. The photograph returned to the center of the table, and with it a concrete threat that made argument secondary. Elena pushed up from the chair and walked to the window. She parted the curtain and squinted into the wet street. The dark sedan had shifted slightly but still idled. A faint headlight pulsed and went dark again. Marco moved beside her and whispered her name, Elena, Marco. He kept his voice low because the rule existed, but his urgency translated into the angle of his words. An external event occurred. A silhouette moved at the far end of the sidewalk and paused under the street lamp. Elena felt the sound of a car door closing in the distance. The street did not belong to them. The presence outside made the kitchen feel exposed. Luca reached into his inner pocket and removed a small stack of documents. He pushed one toward Elena, a photograph of the house taken from across the street, the timestamp layered along the corner showing a date 2 nights earlier. Close to the house, a blurred figure had been captured standing by the stoop. The camera angle suggested deliberate observation. The photograph had a smear of mud on the lower right corner. Luca tapped the smear with his fingernail as if to show the grain of reality behind the image. The conversation turned tactical. Luca used his pen to write a short set of instructions. Do not step outside alone. No phones outside after 9. If you must speak, use the envelope at the table. He slid the note to Marco and to Elena. Marco read aloud from the note even as he read it to himself, and each instruction felt like a new boundary being nailed into the house. Elena did not look away from the photograph. She wrote back a single sentence. I will obey these steps tonight, but tomorrow I want a list of who knows and who ordered this. Marco barked a laugh that was not amused. You want names, he said. You want a map of the men who watch us. He shoved his palms against the table. Luca, give us the names or let me handle it my way. The exchange accelerated. 3 short lines of back and forth that felt like a small skirmish. Luca responded by writing a single line. Not now. Then he looked at Elena and wrote. Forgive me. His handwriting wavered for the first time. Elena felt a churn of resentment and something like relief. Resentment that Luca had kept them apart. Relief that he had not denied danger. She folded her hands around the letter and felt the paper's fibers at the seam. She pressed the folded sheet into her palm as if to feel proof. She thought of the thin silver key on her necklace and the nights she had worn it for courage. She swallowed and nodded once. An unexpected reveal followed. Marco stood and rifled through his scuffed leather jacket pockets, then pulled out a crumpled receipt from a cafe and slammed it down on the table. This is from 2 days ago, Marco. Elena, Luca, someone sat outside the cafe where I work and left a receipt with that same handwriting you showed. I watched them watch the door for an hour. He wrote down what he saw. He keeps track of who leaves and who returns. He is the one in the photograph. Marco's voice went from impatient to steady as he spoke the piece of evidence he had been holding. The room shifted into a new pace. Evidence accumulated in front of them like plates set at a table. Elena felt the weight of small facts pile into a larger truth. The third emotional shift arrived. Cautious trusts solidified into the sharp, practical fear that would guide their next choices. Elena stopped thinking about whether Luca had been right or wrong and started listing steps she could control. She wrote a quick note. List all places you work, Marco. Lena, bring the letters you received here. Luca, show me the men who have power over us. She slid the paper to Marco. Marco took the note and read it out loud, then tore the rubber band off the stack of unsent letters and began sorting them by date. He called names into the room. This one is from Aunt Rosa, this one from the neighbor, this one from you, Dad. Look at this date. Each letter opened with a memory that made Elena flinch, a birthday, an apology, a complaint. The letters were not abstract grievances, but exact moments where people had misstepped and tried to mend. Luca watched Marco handle the letters and then added a new detail on paper. There is a man named Ferraro who runs small errands and passes information. He is likely a scout. Luca underlined the name twice. Marco the name out loud and then slammed his palm on the table. Ferraro, Marco repeated. I've heard that name in the alleys. He works for the others. I can find him. His tone moved from blind anger to something calculated. A small twist surfaced. Among Marco's unsent letters, Elena found one folded and dated the week Luca strengthened the silence rule. The letter was short. I'm tired of fearing it. Read, and signed Luca. Elena looked at the handwriting and then at Luca across the table. His face did not change when she showed it to him. He swallowed and wrote, I wrote that then and I still mean it. I will not let you come to harm. His hand moved more quickly on the paper now. The next external event came when the idling car finally turned its lights on and rolled slowly away. Marco rose and walked to the front door, put his hands on the knob, and felt for a pulse of motion on the porch. He opened the door a crack and looked down the wet street. The car was gone. The small relief that followed was immediate. It did not erase the photographs or the note. It only bought them a sliver of time. Elena folded a new sheet and wrote with a steadier hand. We will follow the rules tonight. We will write to each other tomorrow. Marco will look for Ferraro. Luca will bring proof of who ordered the surveillance. If any of us break these rules, we meet at the old bakery at dawn. She hesitated for a second and then added, Sign it. She pushed the note to Luca and to Marco. Luca slid his gold signet ring across the table and pressed it to the paper with a single stamp in the corner. He wrote his name below and then, in a smaller hand, added, I am sorry. Marco scrawled his name with a scraped flourish and added a short line. I'll find him. Elena signed last, with the small key of the silver necklace pressing briefly against her throat as she bent to mark the page. They followed the new rules that night. Elena washed the dishes, folded the chairs, and kept the letters stacked on the table. She did not step outside. She listened to the house creak and the kettle tick as it cooled. At one point she heard muffled footsteps outside the back fence and held the pen between her fingers until the sound stopped. She wrote a small note and left it half open on the table. Who is Ferraro? She did not send it. She left it where Luca could see. By the time dawn thinned the wet windows, Marco had already left to check the alleys. Luca sat at the table with his hands clasped and a folded envelope tucked into his palm. Elena took a cup of tea and set it down before him. She watched his hands. She felt a modest easing of the anger that had made her come back to the house in the first place and replace it with the cold machinery of planning. She did not forgive. She did not need to yet. She needed to understand. An hour before dawn, the car returned briefly and idled 3 houses down. Marco returned during that hour with a small scrap of paper he had found stuck under a storm drain. A receipt for a train ticket bought the day before and a name scribbled in the corner. Ferrero's. He tossed the scrap onto the table. He had tracked it with the blunt methods he trusted. Luca, this is a start. Marco, we have something. He the names as if listing weapons. Luca folded his own envelope and placed it into the inner pocket again. He had slid a short apology across to Elena that night and she had read it without speaking. The final paragraphs of the chapter narrowed into small actions. The house locked at dawn, a plan written in clear sentences on the tablecloth, and the way the 3 of them moved with purposeful economy. Elena folded the corner of the envelope, as she always did before opening a letter, and then set it on the table where the morning light could catch its edge. Marco checked the window one last time. Luca kept his hands folded and still. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. Luca slid a final short note toward Elena. It read, I will not speak, but I will act. He looked at the street, and then at the window where a silhouette lingered beyond the glass. Elena read the line and signed her name beneath it. Outside, the dark car turned away, but at the neighbor's window a figure did not leave. Someone stayed to watch the house a moment longer. Elena saw the silhouette in the reflection and, instead of feeling the abstract end of a story, she felt the practical pull to the next step. The paper on the table held their agreement. The silhouette in the window held their warning. Elena folded her pen into her pocket, pushed the stack of letters into a neat pile, and closed the kitchen drawer with the soft click of decision. The night had kept its ledger of observations. They had filled their own margins with small rules. The paper, bound covenant, rested between them like a tool. Marco left to follow the leads he had found. Luca stood in the doorway, gloved hands clasped, and did not speak. Elena turned off the kitchen light and felt the echo of the last footsteps as Marco walked toward the street. She left the envelope where she had found it, and the silhouette in the window remained, watching, patient, part of the proof that silence, written and deliberate, would hold them for one more day. The envelope weighed cold in Elena's hand the moment she shut the car door. Suspicion tightened the muscles at her throat as she slit the flap with a thumb. Inside, a glossy photograph showed the house from the hedge, a car parked 2 houses down, and a blurred figure standing under a streetlight. She folded the photograph once and then again, holding it as a proof she could not yet speak about out loud. Marco reached the top step and his voice hit the porch hard. "What is it?" "Marco, show me." Elena nothing aloud. She handed him the photograph without speaking, because one rule had been on the kitchen table when she returned: no spoken conversations, only letters. That rule had kept her from arguing a year ago, and kept her feet off the road then. Now it kept her from answering Marco's question with anything more than a look. Elena's suspicion made her check the driveway light, the underside of the car, the trunk latch. She tapped the photograph with a fingertip, tracing the gravel the watcher had captured. Marco's pulse thudded against her palm when she passed him the image. He glanced at the blurred figure and spat a single word: "Shit." He shoved the photograph toward the door and went down the steps at a run. Elena slipped the picture into her coat and followed 3 strides behind. She did not call Luca. The written rule had become a boundary after the first letter on the kitchen table, and Luca had been the one to place it there. They met Luca at the doorway, where he stood with his coat off and his hands folded as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He reached for the photograph with the deliberate calm he always used. He tapped the image with the pad of his thumb and kept his face a flat line. "Who dropped this?" Marco demanded. "Who took it?" Luca folded the photograph the way he always folded notes, neat and clinical, and slid it into a pocket. He produced a sealed envelope from his inner breast and laid it on the table without a word. Elena watched him place it down. The kitchen light threw a pool of amber over the paper. The envelope on the kitchen table from Chapter 1 had demanded ink over spoken words. Now this new envelope felt like a second demand. Marco paced across the kitchen, the scuffed leather of his boots scuffing against the linoleum. He pushed a mug aside with the heel of his hand. "We can't sit on this. We need names. We need to know who is watching us." Marco's voice was sharp. He spoke as if speed could break the net closing around them. Luca did not match Marco's rhythm. "We do not move without a plan." "Luca, we do not speak, we write. You saw the photograph. You will go with a letter." Elena's mouth wanted to argue. Her fingers found a pen by habit. She wrote one sentence on a scrap: "Be careful." She folded it small and slid it into Marco's hand before he could leave. The house smelled of old wood and the faint trace of Luca's tobacco. Elena sat at the table while Luca wrote instructions in a clean block of handwriting and slid the note across. The instruction was a safety measure. "Curfew check-ins by note, no travel alone." The word consigliere appeared in Luca's note, a name she'd heard in passing before: Antonio. Luca's handwriting suggested suspicion directed outward, but Elena felt a different pull. She remembered the sealed envelope on the kitchen table when she first came back, the rule that had felt like a shield. Now those rules felt like a cage. She folded her napkin into a corner and pressed her thumb over the fold of a letter she had not yet written. Marco tore from the house before Luca could finish sliding the last instruction across the table.
"Marco!"
Luca, and his voice carried a low pressure that made Elena stop. Marco looked back on the porch, breath fogging in the night air. "I will find out who did this," he said. He turned and was gone. Elena shoved a short note into his palm as he passed. "Don't go alone." Marco read it, glared at the handwriting, then shoved it into his jacket and left anyway. The alley where Marco had gone narrowed between a closed flower shop and a boarded garage. The streetlight stuttered, throwing bars across the pavement. Marco moved faster than his shadow, hands clenched, jaw set. He reached where the photograph implied the watcher might have been, next to a low wall, and found the torn corner of an envelope stuck to the curb. As he bent to pick it up, 2 figures stepped out from the dark like a shutter closing. Marco had no time to shout. He fought. Quick, ragged blows, a grab of a wrist, a knock that sent him to his knees. One attacker went for his jacket. The other punched a pocket and a small stack of paper burst into the gutter. Marco rolled free and yanked the papers back, fingers finding a photograph half torn and a smear of ink. He shoved one of the attackers against the shop door and ran toward the sound of shoes on gravel. A shout carried and a woman's voice, Elena's, sliced the night. Elena arrived at the alley's mouth with her coat collar up and the photograph in the back pocket of her coat. She saw two masked men turning, then Marco on the ground, his shirt dark at one sleeve. She did not think of Luca's rules. She thought of Marco's breath and the heat of blood on his sleeve. "Get away from him!" She screamed the first full-spoken sentence she had said in the house in months. The sound hit the alley like a thrown stone. One attacker turned and ran. The other swung and missed. Elena grabbed his arm and sunk her knee into his shin, toppling him. Marco scrambled up, face white except for the smear of gravel's dust. They ran home with shoes dragging and a shredded envelope in Marco's hand. In the kitchen, Luca was already waiting by the table, eyes shadowed but fixed. He reached toward the torn photograph Marco produced and flattened the edges with one slow motion. He lifted his head and caught Elena's stare. Her mouth still trembled from speech. Luca's hands did not move. He produced a folded note and slid it across the table. "New measure, do not leave the house without 2 notes and confirmation." He the last syllable like closing a door. Elena felt the anger that had driven Marco flare into the larger space between them. She placed her palm on the table near the envelope from Luca and wrote one line on a blank card. "We cannot pretend nothing changed." She slid that card into Luca's hand and let her fingers linger on the edge. Luca's thumb tapped the corner of the paper, the same motion he used with notes. He read the sentence and his jaw tightened. He answered with a single word written down: trust. The torn photograph on the table showed a blurred profile Luca did not recognize, but the attackers had left a scrap with a different image folded inside. A doctored shot that placed Luca at a scene his men swore he had never attended. Marco slammed his fist onto the table. "Someone framed you, Luca." Marco aloud, breath coming hard. "Someone wants us to look at you and not out at them." Luca did not rise to the taunt. He wrote a name on a clean fold and pushed it across. Antonio. Antonio was not a public name to Elena. It was the consigliere the family used in muted references. Luca laid the folded paper flat and said nothing else. Elena's mind started moving through action like a checklist. Lock the gates, gather letters to send, inventory the envelopes that had arrived in the past week. She opened a leather-bound notebook and began to write notes in the margins. Who arrived, who left, odd cars, late footsteps. She looked up and saw Luca watching her write. His eyes were steady, steel gray in the low light. She set the pen down and pushed 2 folded notes toward him. "If Antonio is a leak, we will write to him from inside the house," she said. "We will not leave clues outside." Luca slid the notes under a heavy paper weight and kept his hands folded. His voice when he spoke was low. "You did well. Marco did well. We hold the line in ink." The sentence was not praise but a strategy. The next morning, late night slipping into pre-dawn, a courier arrived at the gate. He left a single envelope on the gravel and vanished before anyone could step outside. Elena found it on the passenger seat of her car when she checked for any late deliveries. The envelope bore no return, only a photograph that showed the family entering a restaurant 3 nights prior, a different angle, a different focus. Someone had been following them. Someone had placed images where the family would see them. Elena pressed the photograph flat and noticed a fingernail mark along one corner. The mark was not Luca's. It belonged to someone who used their hands like tools. That night Marco refused to stay inside. He scribbled a note with short, impatient strokes and handed it to Elena. "Tell him I'm going out, Marco," meaning Luca. "Tell him I'm going to find who keeps sending these." Elena folded the note and slid it across. Luca read it and his mouth tightened. He did not forbid Marco. He did not let him go with empty hands. He put a folded envelope into Marco's palm with names and locations in neat script. 2 contacts to check, a pay phone they used years ago, a man named Sergio who kept watch by a pawn shop. Marco shoved the envelope into his jacket and left. Elena stood on the porch and watched his silhouette merge with the night. An hour later, Marco returned with a fresh tear in his shirt and a story that clawed at the idea of an inside job. He had found a man who said he had seen a car waiting by Luca's office the week before. The man named a driver who matched a name Luca's men had dismissed as a courier. Marco thrust a small scrap of paper across the table. This, Marco, he says Antonio came around with a man who wasn't one of ours." Luca's face did not change. He reached behind him, drew a different envelope from the pocket of his suit, and split it open. Inside was a note in Antonio's hand. A message about new alliances, a pressure that read like a negotiation. Luca read the words and then set the paper face down. Elena watched both men react. Marco's reaction moved like a live wire. Fists curled, the need to act. Luca's reaction held like a dam, an inward calculation. Elena put her hand flat on the table and forced her voice down into a note she slid across. Ask Antonio to come alone to the parlor at midnight and bring nothing but a pen. Luca read the line and nodded. He wrote back one instruction. Elena stays with me. That instruction landed like a small, heavy thing on the table and changed the night's shape. Marco hissed and wrote his own counter note. I'll be outside the window. The three of them were now dividing roles by ink rather than speech. Midnight arrived with the parlor light low and the curtains thick. Elena wrote every question on a narrow sheet of paper and folded it like a packet. She coughed once and set the packet on the table where Luca could reach it. The clock ticked in the hall. Footsteps came up the stairs, precise and slow. Antonio's suit was clean, his hands polished, his eyes avoiding Elena's. He placed his folded note on the table and said aloud, I came because Luca sent the letter. He kept his voice steady. Luca did not rise. He slid his hand across the table and lifted Antonio's note, reading the pen strokes carefully. Antonio's note said he had seen a courier. He denied any contact with outsiders that could explain the photographs. Marco, outside the parlor window, tapped a ladder twice to show he was in position. Elena watched Antonio's fingers tremble as he reached for a glass of water. Luca wrote 2 words in a tight hand and pushed the paper across. Truth now. Antonio's throat worked. He slid a folded paper back toward Luca and opened his mouth. I don't know who took those pictures, Antonio, but I know someone approached me 2 nights ago. He offered a payment to move information. I refused. Marco knocked on the window hard enough for his knuckles to ache. The knock was a signal and a challenge. A sudden metallic scrape sounded at the front door. Everyone jumped. Luca's eyes went to the foyer. The foyer door was ajar where no one had left it open. A masked figure pushed inside and moved like a machine toward the parlor. Luca rose and the chair scraped back. Antonio put his hand over his notes and reached for his jacket. Marco burst through the window for a means of entry and Elena shouted one short sentence. Get out! This was the moment the family pact broke. Elena moved between Luca and the intruder and spoke a full sentence to the room in a voice that was equal parts demand and plea. Stop this now, or someone gets hurt, the masked intruder lunged. Luca moved with a speed Elena had never seen outside of fighting shadows. His hand came down hard, a cuff met a jaw, the intruder crumpled to the floor. Elena grabbed at the intruder's shoulder and felt the scrape of fabric and the heat of breath. Marco pinned a second attacker to the rug. Antonio had slid to the floor, hands up, both surprised and guilty at being so quickly outpaced. In the scramble, an envelope burst under the intruder's arm. Elena stooped and picked up a torn photograph that showed Luca at a scene of violence, one she had seen before but in a different light. This image had been staged. Someone had doctored a photo to place Luca where he was not. Outside, police lights cut across the driveway. A neighbor had called them after hearing the noise. Luca looked at the torn photograph and then at Elena. Marco's breath came ragged and fast. Antonio's face had gone pale. Elena put the torn photograph on the table and ran a fingertip over the creased edge until her skin went numb. She wrote 2 quick lines and shoved them toward Luca. Someone is forcing this, someone with access. Luca read the lines, then folded them and placed them in his inner pocket. He walked to the window and peered out, then closed the curtains with deliberate hands. After the intruders were taken by the responding officers, questions and the house secured, the 3 of them returned to the kitchen table with the night's wreckage spread out. Torn envelopes, muddy shoe prints on the rug, a scraped cuff. Elena felt a pressure in her chest she had not named before. A suspicion that did not relent but that now bent under fear and then into a guarded anger. She wrote longer notes, detailed lists, names, times, last seen locations. Marco slumped in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck. We were lucky, Marco, lucky this time. Luca tapped his pen against a folded envelope and said nothing for a long count. He placed his hand over Elena's card and left the pen there like a stake. They set a new rule by ink. Everyone in the house would keep a ledger of notes and who spoke to whom. All deliveries would be opened by 2 people. All messages would be written and signed. Luca wrote a final instruction on a heavy piece of paper and pushed it across. "I will deal with Antonio tomorrow." Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to ask more, to demand the truth, but the night had left her voice raw. She folded a letter and slipped it into Luca's palm. "Do not make enemies you cannot trust." Luca's thumb brushed the fold and then squeezed. He answered in a quick scrawl, "I understand." They sat in the dim kitchen while dawn pulled a thin wash of gray at the horizon. Marco fell asleep at the table with his head resting on his forearms. Elena folded the last of the photographs into a neat stack and slid them into a box. She logged each image with a time and a short note. The ledger began to look like a map of pressure on the family. She closed it and felt the page press under her palm. Then there was a knock at the back door, 3 short, measured taps that sounded almost like a code. Elena paused. Luca's eyes snapped to the door. He rose and crossed the kitchen with the slow economy of motion he used when danger might be at hand. He opened the back door a crack and peered through. A courier stood on the step, hands empty, mouth pressed into a thin line. He handed Luca a single envelope and left without waiting. Luca took the envelope and turned to the table. He slid it open, read 2 lines, and then looked at Elena. The last line of the envelope was a single sentence written in a hand Elena did not recognize. "We will remove those who stand in the way." Elena read the line twice, her fingers cold. The sentence was a promise and a threat. It meant someone was not only watching but deciding outcomes in ink and action. She pushed the paper across to Marco and then to Luca. Marco pushed back. "We need to hit first, Marco." Voice small now. "We need to find the man who leaves these." Luca set the envelope down and tapped his ring against the table until the sound matched the tick of the clock. He wrote 1 sentence and passed it over. "We respond in time and paper, not in rage." Elena folded the page into the ledger and closed it. In the last light before dawn, they made a plan by ink. Marco would tail the courier's next route. Antonio would be summoned again. Luca would test loyalty within his circle. Elena would keep the ledger and the photographs, cataloging details and sending short notes to those who needed them. The house exhaled. Elena pressed her forehead to the cool wood of the table and felt the grain under her skin. She wrote 1 final line in the margin of the ledger and left it open. "I will not let us be divided by someone else's picture." A car door closed 2 houses down. Elena heard it and then the faint crunch of gravel. She stood, folded the ledger shut, and walked to the window. Someone had been watching them all along, but now they had counted the watchers and made a response. Luca stood behind her and put a hand to her shoulder as if to anchor the rule that had nearly broken that night. Ink before speech. She took a breath and slid a small sealed envelope into her pocket, not to speak with, but to carry as a promise that they would answer with paper and with action. Outside, the streetlight blinked off as dawn crept up, and the kitchen clock moved into the day with a steady, ordinary click. The chapter ended not with words, but with the sound of the front gate being bolted from the inside. Elena slammed the kitchen door and found Marco on the tiles, blood darkening his collar and a damp envelope clutched in his fist. Suspicion tightened her jaw the instant she bent over him. She saw the envelope before she heard his breath hitch. Marco's hand opened just enough for a smear of paper to show a single photograph exposed by a fingertip. "Marco, Elena." And her voice cut through the kitchen light like a blade. She checked his pulse with 2 fingers, then looked for the wound. Her hands moved with the same calm she used to fold a corner of an envelope before opening it. Suspicion had been living in her chest since she found the first sealed rule on the table. It pushed her now to act, to test what the photograph meant. Marco's skin was cool, his breathing shallow, and Elena tugged the hem of his shirt aside to see the red and the torn fabric. She pressed a clean napkin to the wound and tied it with the leather lace from her bag. Marco's eyes fluttered open and fixed on her. "Elena," he said in a voice that scraped. "There's photo." He pushed his other hand, trembling, and the photograph slid across the linoleum, stopping against a chair leg. Elena sat back on her heels and picked up the photo. The shot was taken from the far side of the hedge. The Rossi house under the streetlight, a carked 2 houses down, the license plate clear in the amber glow. The camera had captured someone standing at the hedge line, a silhouette near the passenger door. The printed note tucked behind the photograph read 3 words in Marco's hurried handwriting: "Look at the plate." Fear moved through her as a physical thing. Her fingers tightened on the paper until it bent. She did not think of panic as an idea. She thought of doors, locks, the old iron bolt on the pantry that squeaked when you forced it, and of Luca's strict rule about words. The silence rule had been set to deflect attention, to create a break between the family and the world. Now, with Marco bleeding and a new plate written in his hand, silence felt like the wrong shield. Marco tried to pull himself upright. "They hit me," he said, "by the hedge. License Elena. It belongs to—" He stopped, his breath leaving him. He folded his mouth around the next words and failed. Elena helped him to a chair, pressing the napkin harder. "Tell me the plate, Marco. Say it. Say the number." Her voice was steady, but small creases formed at the corners of her eyes. She had decided rules could bend if people bled. The word suspicion had been inside her since the envelope on the table in Chapter 1. Now it pushed her to force a name from him. Marco drew breath with effort. 924, he coughed. 924/T. "I saw it on the hood." His hand shook, so she took his wrist and kept pressure on the cloth. A sudden noise at the driveway made both of them look. Headlights cut through the frosted window. The light painted Luca's silhouette against the doorway when he stepped into the kitchen, closed the door behind him, and smelled the salt and copper in the air before his eyes adjusted. He kept his hands folded at his front, and the envelope in his inner pocket made a soft rectangle under his jacket. Luca moved without hurry. "What happened?" he asked, voice low and controlled. He glanced at Marco's collar, at the photograph in Elena's hand, and then at the napkin tied tight. He did not ask for an explanation in speech. Instead, his thumb tapped the edge of his own folded note, where a line of ink lay on the flap. Elena stood up. "Marco's been hit." He brought another photograph. "There's a plate." "I started a tourniquet." Her sentences came short, each one a precise fact. She kept her eyes on Luca so no silence could be mistaken for consent. Luca's gaze flicked to the photograph. He read the numbers and held them in the same stillness he held everything else. Then he did a small thing he always did when a paper mattered. He tapped the corner of his own letter with his thumb and, without opening it, set it on the table. The movement was a claim. The silence rule was his ritual. Even now, with blood, he preferred that ritual. He slid the letter across the wood until it rested against the photograph Elena had brought. Marco coughed and tried to laugh, sharp and dry. "Of course they'd watch us." After what happened with the hedge photos, he cut himself off and a spurt of pain made him wince. Elena remembered the first envelope she had found at the table, the single line on the flap telling them to write. She remembered the earlier photograph she had found in the car, a house from the hedge and a blurred figure. Those images had been the starting points. She tucked that memory into the back of her head like a spare bandage. It had to fit with what lay in front of her. Luca reached into his inner pocket and produced, carefully, a small metal object. He set it on the table between the letters. A spent bullet casing, dull brass catching the kitchen light. He did not lift his eyes when Elena looked at it. "Where did you get that?" "Elena." Luca's jaw tightened. "Found it on the stoop when I came in." "It wasn't there yesterday." He kept his hands folded after the motion, as if he could lock the noise away with his posture. "Someone moved closer." "Someone from my circle or someone who can follow my circle." "That changes things." His voice was measured. He kept the word "changes" like a tool. Marco's fingers closed on his throat and then relaxed. "The car, Elena, the plate, it's not local. It's a rental. I checked the last digits against the tag in the photo. It links to the ferry terminal pass Luca kept in the drawer." He coughed again, blood flecking his lips. "They came from the east side. They watched the shift. They watched us." His eyes sharpened despite the pain. Luca's face showed the first break. A thin line at the corner of his mouth where worry sat. He reached for his folded letter, pushed it open with a spare thumb, and revealed a few handwritten words with a quick, deliberate stroke. Elena read the words leaning over the table. The handwriting was not Marco's. It was neat, blocky, someone who had learned to keep ink unemotional. The note said, "Not ours." Elena felt an internal change move through her. Suspicion slid into a sharper, hollowing fear. She recognized the particular cold that comes when someone you trust is no longer a defender but a potential target. She rose and moved to the counter where the phone charger lay. "I'll call the number back for the rental," she said. Luca put a hand on her forearm. "No calls, no spoken word." He did not raise his voice. "We follow the rule. We write. We don't tip anyone off." He looked at Marco, then at Elena. For the first time since he walked in, his eyes softened and then hardened. "We write what we must. Words on paper will not echo to them. Speak only if you must save a life." Not to explain, his mouth tightened on the last phrase, almost a whisper. Elena felt the tension reconfigure again. From fear to anger, the move from suspicion to fear had focused her. Luca's insistence on writing pushed at her impulse to act with speech. Marco's breathing hitched. "We can't wait. If they know a rental plate." He stopped and closed his eyes. An insistent knocking at the kitchen door interrupted the exchange, the sound flat and hard against the wood. All three heads turned in the same motion. The knock came again, louder, and a voice from the threshold said, "Open up. Police. Open now." The voice was muffled by the frosted glass, but certain. Elena's hand went to the bolt by instinct. Elena's heart shoved noise into the room. She moved toward the door without speaking, muscles moving like machinery. The third emotional shift happened then. Anger collapsed into focused urgency. She felt Luca's weight at her shoulder even before his hand closed over the bolt. She was sliding. Luca took a step back from the door. He kept his hand on the envelope on the table, as if the paper were a lever. "Do not open on command from outside," he said. "We say nothing. We write them a note that says, 'Identify yourself.' We don't call." He did not raise his voice. His baritone was a tool again. The voice at the door changed. "Luca Moretti, open up now." "Luca, you don't get to hide. We have a warrant." The words came faster, thick with authority. Marco tried to rise, the nausea in his face replaced by a fierce movement. "Open it," he said, hoarse. "If they say police, open. We can't risk them breaking down the door." He pushed the napkin back into place with shaking fingers. "They used the rental. They planted the photo to make you think someone else. We need to know who's inside." His breath burned. Luca's hand closed over his own folded note, and he made a choice that pulled the silence packed apart. He stepped to the doorway, set his shoulder against the frame, and then leaned in toward the frosted glass. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not reach for his phone. He put his mouth close to the pane so he could hear if the voice wavered. "Who is it?" he said, and the single-spoken question hit the kitchen like a thrown stone. His voice was flat and raw in a way Elena had not heard before. There was an apology threaded through the tone that did not belong to the ritual. The voice outside answered, "Faster, Luca, it's Officer Ramo. We have orders to check the property. Step away from the door." The voice tried to keep calm. Luca's eyes flicked back to Marco. He saw the panic under the lid, the way Marco's jaw worked when he tried not to shout. Luca stepped away from the pane and toward his son. He put both hands on Marco's shoulders in the way a father steadies a child on skates. "We will open, Luca." And the word carried both strategy and something like confession, "but not to you, officer. We will open because Marco cannot stand. Help him to the ambulance." The sentence was for the outside, but it was also a line for the inside. He had broken the rule to save the boy. The sound at the door changed immediately. Shouts, the clang of metal, then a flash of light as someone rammed the lock. Movement filled the doorway. A silhouette with a gun slung at the hip, a second figure pressing forward. The intruder slammed the door, and the lock splintered under force. Elena grabbed the dinner knife from the counter. Luca moved in front of Marco. The photograph lay between them like proof of how they had been watched. The intruder's boot hit the threshold, wood splintered outward. The intruder had a gun. It winked in the amber kitchen light. Luca moved first. He threw his weight forward and shoved Marco behind him. The motion was not graceful. He let out one single sharp sound that was neither a shout nor a curse but an ordering down. The word landed hard. He positioned his body between the gun and Marco's chest, arms spread. The intruder's light fell on Luca's face and paused. For a sliver of a breath, the man on the threshold read the older man's features. The square jaw, the scar along the right side, the gold signet glinting at his finger. Then the intruder fired. The shot did not strike Luca. The bullet thudded into the table leg where the photograph had been. A loud, sudden cracking. Splinters sprayed across the wood. Elena hit the floor beside Marco, pressed her palm to his head to tilt it away from the glass. She tasted metal on her tongue. The room filled with noise, someone swearing, the scrape of boots, Luca's heavy breath. The intruder forced forward, eyes scanning faces, and then a second figure slipped in behind him and moved with practiced efficiency. They were trained. Words began to fly across the room, not the written ones Luca preferred. "Stay down, Luca." He stepped closer to the man with the gun and pulled something from his jacket, a black leather glove he had not worn before, and flung it at the intruder's elbow. The glove struck the sleeve and the man flinched. Elena saw Luca's hands move to the intruder's wrist and felt the world narrow to a knot of muscle and leather. The second figure reached for something at the intruder's back. Marco cried out, a sound that forced Elena to look up. The second figure's hand came away empty. A sound from the hallway, a heavy thud, made the intruder's turn. In that instant, Luca twisted, used the intruder's momentum, and forced the gun aside. The weapon discharged again. The shot rasped into the kitchen cabinet, and a jar of wooden spoons toppled. One spoon broke and skittered across the floor like a small accusation. The second figure cursed and lunged for the door. Luca had both men trained in his movements. He pushed the intruder toward the open doorway and then shoved him out with a controlled motion that put him under the steps. The second figure stumbled and fled into the night, boots catching on the step and dragging him into the street. Silence crashed in the kitchen after the scuffle, such that Elena could hear her own pulse in her ears. The smell of burnt gunpowder hung low. Luca kept his hands steady on Marco's shoulders until the boy's breathing finally eased. He was breathing less shallowly now, slower. Elena's hands shook when she untied the napkin only to re-tie it tighter. They listened at the window. The streetlight cast a pool of amber. Beyond it, a shadow moved away, quick and deliberate. The rental car's shape pulled into a turn and disappeared at the corner. No sirens came. No one called from the street. The world outside retreated as if the intruders had taken the noise with them. Luca opened his mouth, closed it, and then spoke, softly and plainly. "I broke the rule because Marco was breathing wrong. I am sorry I didn't write first." He put both palms up on the table and then folded them. He held his apology in his hands as if placing it where they could all see. Elena watched his face for a long time. He had an exposed line at the edge of his eyes that she had not seen in years. She could name his failure and his reason at once. "You kept us alive," she said. Her voice was a dry thing. She did not make a judgment. She made a fact. Marco nodded once, slow and painful. He coughed and then laughed in short bursts that left his chest raw. "You spoke," he said, looking at Luca. "You a thing." The sentence was small and amazed in equal measure. Luca put his hand flat on the photograph and the spent casing. He looked at Elena. "We write to keep them from hearing. But sometimes a single spoken order saves a life. I can't pretend the ritual is perfect anymore." His fingers tapped the corner of the letter like a metronome. Elena felt another shift move through her, uncertainty bending toward guarded relief. She forced herself to take concrete steps. She tore a strip of cloth from a dish towel and made a fresh dressing for Marco, smoothing it down until the edges held. She cleared the photograph of splinters and set it beside the envelope Luca had opened earlier. They sat like that in the damaged kitchen while dawn began a slow, cool change outside the curtains. The house felt altered. The letter rules had not been erased, but a new line had been drawn. Luca took a pen from his inner pocket and a fresh envelope from his jacket. He hesitated once, then wrote with a deliberate slowness. He folded the paper and slid it across to Elena, read it aloud. He asked quietly. The question was an offering. After the night had split rules, he wanted to re-anchor them in something both honest and small. Elena did not read it aloud. She slid the paper open with the corner of her fingernail and read the line he had written. "I use my voice to save Marco. We will keep the written rule but allow spoken commands to save life." She felt the letter's ink like a hinge. Elena drew a breath and then wrote a line back on the same envelope, a reply, not a speech. She pushed it to him. The words were short. "I will follow that rule. If you break it again, tell us why in ink as soon as you can." Luca's hand closed around the reply. He placed both letters in the middle of the table and then reached into his jacket again. This time he retrieved nothing sharp and nothing that glinted. He took a small, plain envelope from the breast pocket where he kept numbers and receipts. He slid it upright into the windowsill, just behind a row of teacups where the morning light could find it. The letter on the sill was blank on the outside. Luca turned and looked at Alina. His face was heavy in a way that the photograph could not show. Not because of the secret life he led, but because of the cost of protecting those he loved. Nothing. He only watched the street until a delivery truck passed and the neighborhood settled into the day. Marco coughed and tried to sit up. Alina helped him to the couch and wrapped the throw around his shoulders. He kept looking at the photograph on the table, the rental plate numbers inked into his mind. They followed the ferry runs, he said. They watched the men who came through Luca's deliveries. Someone in his circle sold them a schedule, or someone on the street copied it down, he exhaled. Either way, we were a target. Again Luca put his fingers to his lips, and then went to the small box by the stove where he kept his gold signet ring when he slept. He opened it without noise and placed the ring on the table near the photograph and the spent casing. That gesture was both admission and a caution. I will tighten the network. I will ask questions I have not asked before. I will not let this happen again. He did not make promises to change his entire life. He listed specific actions, calls he would make, watches he would set, names he would test. Alina watched him do the work of a man who measured risk in quiet steps. She felt the fear move again, this time thinning into a wary determination. She began to write a note on a scrap of paper. Check ferry logs, cross, check rental plate, see who signed for the delivery last month. She folded it and dropped it in Luca's open letter pile. Outside, a car door slammed, a neighbor's radio clicked, life taking its ordinary steps. The house made small, practical sounds. The kettle kicked once, the neighbor's truck passed, and somewhere a child called for breakfast. Inside, the family rebuilt a fragile order from splintered wood and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Later, when the sun lifted higher, Luca stood at the door and watched the street stretch empty and ordinary. He had written a new sentence into their code and placed it in a place where dawn would catch it first. Alina sat at the table, folding another envelope, thinking of the first one she had found months before that had told them to write. She lifted the photograph and compared the plate again to the words Luca had left in his opened letter. The numbers matched what Marco had said. The pattern was clear now. Someone from outside had climbed closer, someone who could read Luca's routines. The twist stayed with her. The breach was not a simple attack. It used a rental and a ferry schedule to look like chance. That meant intent and planning. She wrote a short line and slid it into the envelope beneath Luca's. We will be quiet. We will also prepare. The act of writing steadied her hands. At dusk that evening, Luca placed a sealed envelope on the windowsill facing the street. The envelope had 2 sentences inside. Alina read them twice. The first line admitted his failure to maintain silence when a life was at stake. The second line set a new rule. Written boundaries preserved, with explicit exceptions for immediate danger. Any spoken order must be acknowledged in ink within 24 hours. They agreed to the rule by folding their hands and touching the paper. Marco squeezed Alina's knuckles and then let go. The family's lines had shifted. The ritual of letters remained, but breath and speech could cross the threshold again when lives hung in the balance. Before bed, Alina put a fresh envelope on the kitchen table and a photograph beneath it, one of the rental car, the plate circled in black ink. She left the napkin in a small pile beside it, a red stain faint in the center. She locked the pantry bolt that squeaked and checked the window latches. Outside, 2 blocks away, someone who had watched them that night drove past in a different car. The tires whispered on wet asphalt. The streetlight washed the sedan in the same amber the kitchen had worn earlier. For a moment, Alina watched that reflection in the window and thought of the rule they had made. Letters first, except when silence costs a life. She slid into bed and set her fountain pen on the bedside table like a tool. The night's edges had been blunt. Some things were broken and some things were mended with ink. She breathed and felt the small rhythm of her chest. The letter on the windowsill waited for morning light to read it again. Luca's choice had changed how they would keep each other safe, and in that change there was both loss and a clear, practical way forward. At dawn, Luca added one more small line to the opened envelope on the sill. If I speak, I will write why. He closed the flap and left the paper where the sun would find it first. Elena watched him go, and then she sealed the photograph in a fresh envelope and slid it into the inner pocket of her worn wool coat. She left the pen on the table and the envelope by the door. The chapter ended not with a speech or a promise to become someone new, but with a concrete act. Luca locking the kitchen bolt and writing a line that would both account for his words and bind him to them. The family had a new boundary, written and punctuated with the night's evidence. The rule could no longer be an absolute shield. It was now a tool whose edges were tested by the sound of a knock, the flash of a gun, and the need to keep a boy breathing while the world pressed close. When the front door closed and the house settled into the day's business, Elena tucked the photograph deeper in her coat and walked to the corner where the ferry pass list would be copied later. She did not speak. She walked to work with a plan in ink and a line in her hand. Suspicion had moved them to action, fear had taught them to bend, and the letter on the sill would hold Luca to the only honest thing left: accountability written in black ink. The last image the chapter leaves is concrete. An open envelope on the windowsill catching the pale dawn, the pen beside it, and Luca's gold watch glinting as he shut the front gate. It was a small, clear decision recorded on paper. It was not a promise in the abstract. It was a small, binding proof they could show each other when words came back into their home.